Hello, and welcome to BESEATV, where we celebrate, connect, and showcase BC talent. And if you're new to the channel, please like, share, and subscribe, and touch that little bell so you can are updated on our new material. And if you've not done that before and you're not new, please do that anyway. Today I'm joined by Lucy Sheen. Lucy, can you introduce yourself?
Hi, I'm Lucy. I'm an actor, writer and activist. Yes.
Welcome. Lucy, I understand you were actually born in Hong Kong.
Yes, I was born in Hong Kong, also orphaned there, and then put up for adoption and literally exported on a BESEA flight. That's what they were before they were British Airways. And then picked up at the other end at London Airport by the family that was adopting me, who'd never seen me before, never stepped foot out of the country before, as far as I'm aware. And I started my new life, as it were. I'm one of 106 Hong Kong foundlings. We were the first group of purposely and sanctioned transracial adoptees to this country, which happened kind of like during the 50s and early 60s.
So did you you didn't have any choice about this, obviously. It does seem like it was a bit like a catalogue. Did they actually see who you were before they adopted you? Or
I think they saw a picture, possibly. Okay. I don't know. I suspect a lot of people are too young to remember this, but there used to be a thing when I was a small child called Sunny Smiles, which is a book of photographs of babies, of children, very cute, smiley, and you would go around and you would sell the Sunny Smile for charity. Oh. I think there was a book that was a bit like that, that contained all of the pictures of the Hong Kong foundlings that were up for adoption. Originally, we were meant to be, or it was hoped that we would be adopted by Asian American families, because obviously the community there is much larger, much more established in a very different way to the British East Asian and Southeast Asian community over here. But none of the families wanted us because we were all girls. Yeah. You are talking about during the 50s and 60s. So, yeah. So obviously Hong Kong being a British colony, it was the natural next step was offering the children to see if people wanted to adopt in the UK. I think a couple of babies were adopted to families who ended up going to Canada and Australia, but I think they originally came here, and obviously the families then went to those places. I have heard of some of the later Hong Kong families being adopted to families in South America. I think the adoption process, the part that I was involved, that I was part of, I think stopped in the early 60s. I believe I was on the penultimate flight. So the last, kind of like one of the last tranches of babies that were sort of flown out from Hong Kong under that program. And then adoption sort of to overseas families became more difficult in 1973. Don't quote me on that. Okay. The rules changed.
So do you remember much of your life in Hong Kong before the flight?
No, I do remember the flight, and I was told, I can't remember who it was. I think it may have been some sort of social worker, and indeed also the people that adopted me, that I was kind of like making this up. But I do actually remember being sick down the back of an air hostess as I think they were trying to sort of calm me down. I was 11 months old. Oh. I remember smells. I was told again when I was younger that that was silly, that you couldn't possibly remember that, but I firmly do think that some of those things are so sensory things are so evocative that they go beyond what, you know, sort of what we as grown-ups put on to perceptions and memories. And memories are not just the playbook. I think we forget that memories can also be sensory. So apparently, and this is one thing that was in my international social services file when I eventually realized that I had one, which wasn't until over half a century later, that I used to do this really kind of like little dance and do what was called sing sing when I smelt rice that was boiling, which is obviously a memory from being in the orphanage. And I used to go nuts apparently, and they thought it was quite weird, but obviously that now makes sense.
Yeah.
So that I do remember. Apparently, I was beginning to kind of form Cantonese sounds, and there's an entry into one of those reports that she has her own little language and goes around, which is kind of like quite patronizing. And actually, when I read it, it's actually quite sad that I was already at that stage developing that propensity, which obviously I lost, because in the 60s, you know, sort of where would you go even if you wanted your adopted child to learn to speak Cantonese or even Mandarin? Where would you go? Because there wasn't the internet. You know, sort of it was done academically, so there was none of the resources that we have now to try and pick up a language. That was just an impossibility.
So were you placed outside of London? Because I was brought up in the 70s. I was born in the 60s, brought up in the 70s. I do remember there was a Chinatown in London, but I suppose if you were brought up outside of London, it would have been harder to sort of connect with things.
I didn't come across sort of Chinatown until I was in my sort of mid-teens, the rebellious stage, I suppose. I was brought up, yes, outside of London, in a very conservative, capital C and I suppose small c, area of southeast England, where it was predominantly church spires, cricket greens and cucumber sandwiches. And I was the only non-white entity apart from an Indian restaurant. It wasn't even an Indian takeaway, it was an Indian restaurant, and there wasn't even a Chinese takeaway. So you know, I grew up in a time when I vividly remember the rise of the National Front. So that was the era. I mean, I came to Britain only a few years after the race riots, the Notting Hill race riots, and 4 or 5 years before Enoch Powell's now infamous Rivers of Blood speech. So that was the England, the Britain that I came into, which was a Christian white country.
So, I mean, did you feel like you fitted into that community and your family? No.
I mean, I think even from an early age, I knew that there was something different about me and the setup. And I suppose it wasn't until I was about 4 or 5 that I was able to begin to vocalize that. And yes, I mean, you know, sort of, as ever, children are always cruel. They will find the weaknesses, if that's because you are slightly chubby or you wear glasses or you have braces, or as in my case, I look the way that I do. I got bullied like lots of other children who didn't fit into that normative white, blue-eyed, blonde-haired, you know, sort of view of what predominantly the rest of society was. So, you know, I was just another thing that was to be, you know, sort of ridiculed because I was the odd one out, you know, and it just happened to be because of the colour and my sort of facial features.
So did you actually manage to connect to the Chinese community as it would have been in those days?
No, I mean, I was brought up ostensibly in a white household, with all of the, I think, the unwritten expectations, both on my adoptive parents' side and me, to be having the same privileges. And it came as quite a shock when I started going to school, particularly, you know, by the time I went to infant school, to realize that I wasn't perceived like that. I was not, you know, sort of, I spoke the same language, I was brought up in the same culture, but I was not treated the same, most definitely. As I said, the people who adopted me had never stepped foot outside of this country. They had no connection to East Asia or you know, sort of China or Asia as a whole. And like I said, you know, with no internet, no, you know, none of those resources. If you wanted a book, you had to physically go to a library. If it wasn't there, you had to put in and wait for maybe a week, 2 weeks or 3 weeks until that book was sent over from another library, and you toddled back, you picked it up, you took it away for 3 weeks, hoped that you could read it. And if not, you had to go back to the library and ask for it to be extended. So those were the kind of like the days that I grew up in. Also, you know, sort of this country and the West was still very much in the Cold War, and the attitudes towards places like Russia and China were very fixed, and it was fearful. I mean, I vividly remember my adoptive mother telling me off when the first time that I asked questions about, you know, sort of, where am I from, how come I'm here, and I was told that, you know, asking questions would get me into trouble. I would be kidnapped by somebody from the Chinese embassy and taken back to China, put in a commune, and have a very miserable life. That was the extent of the fear that was still here in 50s, 60s Britain about people who looked Chinese, I think. That uneducated ignorance, or the buying into the Western propaganda of what China was, or what they thought it was, under obviously now as it was then. So no, I mean, there were no other people of color that I recall as a child, and especially not people of East Asian or Southeast Asian descent. The only places that you saw, or I ever saw, people of the same, you know, sort of racial heritage as me is when I started kind of like going to Chinatown in London, bunking off school and going there. So no, it was I was the only East Asian in the village, as it were. You know.
So obviously your history must have sort of like coloured the career that you were going to go into. Did it? I mean, I know you went into acting. Did you go straight into acting, or?
No, I mean, that was not the plan. I had originally fully intended to, and was going to go to music college, but I decided in a moment of being sensible, which is unusual for I think a school kid, that I was going to complete my O-levels and my A-levels before taking up music college. And in between that decision of doing my O-levels and then not particularly wanting to stay at the secondary modern school that I'd spent 5 years of hell at, I ended up going to Isleworth Polytechnic, as it was then, and doing the only pre-vocational course in the country, which was creativity-based, arts-based. So I studied art, fine art and theatre design, film studies, drama. It was the only place that was doing a drama O-level at that time, and English. Yeah. And after, well, obviously, it's not to be unexpected after doing a year of that, I thought, and realizing that I was kind of okay at it and I enjoyed doing the acting thing. And then it being a possibility of me auditioning for drama school. Then there were only, 5 drama schools, plus the Bristol Old Vic School, Bretton Hall, Warwick University. That was it. It was still expensive, but those were your options. So I auditioned, and I was lucky. I was offered places, but the only place that I could actually afford to go to, even then with a grant system, was Rose Bruford, which is where I ended up spending 3 years of my life. Yes, that was not the original intention for, you know, and that's just the way that it worked. And I survived 3 years at Rose Bruford. I graduated beyond my belief. Actually got some letters after my name, and as they say, the rest is history.
It's interesting you said survived. Was it really difficult there?
That's being slightly ingenuous, but don't forget you're talking about the 70s, 80s. Attitudes then were a lot more entrenched, shall we say, about diversity and difference on screen, on stage. If you were going to be that character, then it was very much a prescribed characterization, very much a stereotype, very much a racial trope. Unfortunately, I would have to say that still, a lot of that, unfortunately, still has not changed, particularly when we're talking about British, UK TV and film. It has gotten better. I think stage productions where how people of colour in general are perceived has gotten much better. However, it's taken over 40 years for us to get there. So it's not a lot to be kind of like jumping up and down at, I would say. And as far as BCs go, we are still very much the bottom of the pile. We are still very much mired in that, I think, lazy representation and unnuanced view of what and who we are, still very much through the white man's gaze. And I say man specifically because invariably he is white, middle-aged, usually Oxbridge educated, who decide, you know, how and who these stories are authored by and what the narrative is or is not. So that was the era that I was brought up in, that I entered into. You know, sort of, I was famously told, well, say by somebody from the college, that all I could expect was to be playing whores, illegal immigrants, and drug addicts, and I would make a very good life out of that. And that, to me, was like weird, because that's not what, you know, that's not the life that I know or have kind of like had come across. You know, none of that reflected my reality, or indeed the reality of the limited amount of BCs. At the time, we were then referred to as Orientals or Chinese, irrespective of where in East Asia you came from. You were still Chinese. That was how enlightened those times were. So it was irksome, and I bucked the trend in the fact that I was the first role that I got cast in was the lead in a feature film, which was very much not the norm. It was about what it was to be both British and Chinese for the lead character, which was Elaine Choi, which is the character that I played, someone who hadn't really thought about what it meant to be of Chinese heritage, and wasn't particularly, in some senses, when the film picks up, particularly interested in that. And it was through the course of the film and the plot of that film, sorting out a Chinese will, that she began to kind of think about that duality. And it was the first time that subject had ever been tackled in that way in a British film. obviously that prior to that, there had been the Chinese detective. Our co-star, well, the other lead was played by David Yip. So yes, I mean, that was interesting, and that took me away from that mold of what I called then and still do call now, because there's still a fair amount of those roles, Chinese takeaway, me no speaky roles.